Before you came on, I was talking to my audience about this because I have this debate pretty consistently, most of the time with people on the left who feel like I'm a transphobe or something like that. But I was telling them, I think you are like the person who is best at debating this topic right now. So I wanted to talk to you about it because the debate you had with Vaush, the debate you had with Hunter, it was just so blatantly obvious you knew so much more than them. Like they had absolutely no clue what they were talking about. So, all right, you've been listening, eh?
Yeah, I heard some of it. Some person I debated on gender from modern day debates was up there. So.
Radical Coder.
Right. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, I know Radical Coder. Do you watch any streams at all?
Be honest, not really. I kind of just started the YouTube thing, so not often.
I went to your YouTube because I was trying to find a way to contact you at first, and I couldn't find anything there. And you don't really have anything on your YouTube either.
Yes. I
do you
posted
plan on
one
doing
video.
content?
Yes, but I've just been putting it off because I'm really busy these days, but I will definitely at some point start making content.
How did you get it? The first debate I saw you do was with Vaush. Is that the first debate that you had done?
No, I originally started on TikTok. I did a lot of debates on there about various topics, and then James reached out to me to do some on YouTube, and I debated Hunter Avallone before I debated Vaush, and I debated a couple people here and there. That was probably the biggest debate, though.
Oh, wait, you debated Hunter Avallone first. I thought you just recently debated Hunter Avallone after Vaush.
No. That one happened first, and then the following couple weeks I debated Vaush.
Oh, okay. That makes sense. Did you know who any of these people were?
Yeah, I'd seen them. Especially those two are very popular, so definitely knew who those two were.
Okay. All right. Do you have like what got you into talking about gender specifically?
I would say it's just something that kind of came up. I noticed a lot of people, what is a woman? And then I saw people were discussing it, and I saw people give various answers to it. It kind of got me interested in answering the question myself. So then that started when I started researching biology and molecular genetics and stuff like that, and just a little bit of linguistics and how words are used and concepts and things like that. So I guess just what got me interested was other people talking about it and debating it.
That's cool. Yeah, you seem to understand linguistics better than Vaush or Hunter Avallone. I watched all of your Vaush debate. I watched some of your Hunter debate through, I think it was Big Papa Fascist who was reviewing it. And that one was just, he was reviewing your debate with Hunter. That was just hilarious, dude. That was insane, the things that Hunter was saying. It's so funny. And I've actually messaged him a couple of times because I know him. I just had his wife on here like last week. But anytime I message him to talk to him about gender, he just doesn't. He doesn't talk to me. He won't do it. I don't know what his issue is, but he has absolutely no clue what he's talking about. Like I feel like he's literally making it up as he goes. It sounds so ridiculous.
Right. Wait, who is the person you mentioned that reviewed the debate? Because I don't even think I've seen that review myself.
Do you know who The Crucible is, the channel?
Oh, yeah. Okay, I did see that. I did see that one.
Yeah, so Andrew, he's been called Big Papa Fascist for a long time. That's what he's gone by on the internet. So,
okay, gotcha.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, so I same thing. I got into like Twitch politics and started talking to people about gender. I worked in like a field that like gave me I guess more of an interest in the topic, and so I started researching it and started writing like documents on it just to kind of explain to people what they were all talking about. This is all before the what is a woman stuff ever started at all, or like Matt Walsh started going off on trans people or anything. So I guess let me just kind of frame my argument. Because I I believe yours is generally that like a man is like a biological male, right? It's an adult human male. Yes?
Right. Yes.
Okay. Do you separate sex and gender at all?
I think gender is a pretty arbitrary concept. So I guess the best, closest way I could use it is the human conception of the sexes. So sex would still be the necessary condition.
Okay. So I would say a man is or I guess let's say a woman is an adult feminine human, and then femininity is like the traits and characteristics that we associate with females. So kind of the way that you explain it, but a couple extra steps in there. So like when we say gender is on a spectrum, when we think of like the spectrum, we're thinking of more or less masculine characteristics and feminine characteristics. So like we can have on one end like the most masculine person you can imagine, like Hulk Hogan is the prototype of a male or of a man. And then the more feminine characteristics within the concept, the farther away from him you get, until you get all the way, all feminine characteristics, and you're on the opposite end where it's like Marilyn Monroe, who's the other prototype on the opposite end. In the middle, we would have some sort of gray area that's like an androgynous person, but the two sides seem to be categorized as man and woman. And I say that because it seems like when we call somebody man or woman, we're not looking for chromosomes, we're not looking for gametes, we're not looking for penises and vaginas, we're looking for masculine and feminine characteristics. They can be biological, they can be socially constructed. There's a number of ways that we do this, but they seem to all be signaled to us through masculine and feminine characteristics.
Yeah, so I definitely see that point of view. And this is something that a lot of, I guess, gender expansionists argue is that, oh, when I see you, I don't see your chromosomes or your genetics or your genitalia or anything like that, but we still refer to you as a man or woman. But I think this is sort of something we do for everything. When we, as to take Dr. Bogardus's example, when we imagine water, we don't think about the molecular compositions, yet that is still how water is defined. When we think of gold, we don't think of its molecular composition, but that is still how gold is defined. So I do agree that we make inferences based off, typically the way things look. However, I don't think that has any bearing on how we truly define things. I think we would still consider more masculine women, right? Even if they look more like a male. If they said that they were female and they said that they were a woman, I think most people punitively would agree it would be pretty offensive to refer to them as a man and such. So I think for those reasons, I disagree with that view, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so I've been planning on talking to Bogardus about this as well. Science doesn't really define things, though. Like, they can explain the elements, but generally we have a word, and then they explain what it is that we're, like, they'll describe the word to us, right? So science can say, okay, well, this is what you call a female. We're going to tell you what the essential thing is that you're describing when you say female. But that's not necessarily what we're actually labeling female, right? Just as like with woman, we can label this something a bit differently. So gender to me seems obviously to be a different thing from sex, that there are these groups of characteristics that are masculine and feminine, and those things do seem to signal sex to us. They do seem to be things that align with our sex, even whether they're biological or not. Carrying a purse is obviously not a biological thing, but it is something that signals sex to us. So it's obviously a different thing from sex, right? It's obviously a different way of categorize, or it's a different categorization from sex.
So I think with this view, I think we might have femininity and masculinity, but I think conflating these terms with man and woman, just because of how they present to us, typically, and what we associate them, just wouldn't be correct, because for example, if we had fool's gold and real gold, and phenotypically they presented the same to both of us, I still think that given more information, we would change the way we describe one versus the other. The same way if you see somebody that looks like a female, but then, given they look more feminine in your words, but given more information, we find out that they're a male, then we would change and refer to them as a male instead. So I think the same sort of goes with sex and gender and man and woman, if that makes sense.
It does, but like we don't need, so when you say given more information, we don't need science to tell us whether or not it's fool's gold or real gold, right? Like we already had different values for those two things without a scientific understanding of them.
I think you would need some type of science. I think you would need to measure density, floatability, and if that doesn't work, measure protons, chemical composition. I could think you would need some type of further inquiry.
Well, I think that, I suppose in some way, like weight and density are scientific to some extent, but we can also tell those things by ourselves. Like we can also tell that fool's gold is just much lighter than real gold, and that it doesn't dent the same as real gold.
Yeah, so like even say they had the weight and density being similar, I think there are further inquiries that would need to be done to verify that. And I think any of those inquiries that we're doing is still a scientific process we're engaging in because science is just sort of the study of reality. We're just gaining knowledge about reality. So any test that we're doing on said object is still scientific inquiry, in my opinion.
So before we had scientific processes, do you think that we were just running around making necklaces out of fool's gold instead of real gold? Or do you think we were able to tell the differences between the two?
I think that probably before we had scientific knowledge of gold as an element, people would refer things to gold that punitively we would agree aren't gold. Like maybe they see a yellow looking granite rock and they would call that gold when that wouldn't be correct.
Sure. Well, what I mean is that, like, colloquially, they were able to understand the differences. Like, one person might not understand the differences between the two, but colloquially, they would understand the differences. Like, as a society, they're not going to go make some necklace for Caesar out of fool's gold. Like, it's going to go through enough people to where they understand the differences between real gold and fool's gold. And my point in saying this is we even knew the differences between a man and a woman without science. Like, we had these labels for them without ever having science for these things because we knew what we were labeling before science explained it to us.
Yeah, so I think we can be mistaken about something scientifically. Like, for example, when people used to believe that only when people used to believe that there wasn't that males could get pregnant, or people used to believe things like, I'm trying to think of the best example for this. When people used to believe that the only people that should be in charge of children were women due to biological processes, or only women can breastfeed. That's another example. Like a lot of people used to believe that only women have breasts, but that's actually not scientifically correct, right? Looking into later technology, we find that out. So I think stuff like that, when we have further inquiry, it lends to better knowledge. Does that make sense?
Yes, but okay, so like with Bogartus's example of water, um, like H2O is technically what we're describing, but we all know it's water. We all used water for a very long time before we ever knew that it was H2O that we were describing. And we understood how to use it, and we understood what it was that we were engaging with and how to engage with it. We had labels for water, and were able to communicate water without having any sort of scientific understanding of it. Modern day, we're capable of having these understandings and getting more detail, but it doesn't change the way that most people are actually engaging with water or what they're communicating when they talk about water, right?
So say we had another like colorless, odorless, clear solution, right? Somebody might refer to it as water. But then if you explain to them like, oh no, that's actually just an involatile compound that's is not H2O, then they probably would cease to call it water, I would think. Like, wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, well, so it would be based on like the utility of that communication. Like, what is it that you're wanting to get across when you communicate that, and what is actually useful information there? Lots of times when we're talking about water, like, it's whether or not you can drink it or whether or not you can use it for some other sort of mixture. Like, there's something that you're trying to get out of that communication when you say water. But when we say woman, is very, 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 like, small percentages of the time does her biology actually matter to us. It's completely irrelevant by far the majority of the time. There are times where it matters, and I think that that's, like, important to have distinctions between male or female and woman, because lots of times we do care about the biology. Lots of times that part is important to us, and by far the majority of the time, being a woman and being a female are going to align with one another, but what we're communicating with these things are different. Like, if every time I see somebody in high heels, tights, makeup, long hair, a dress, I keep calling them women, and I don't care about their biology, I just want to communicate to somebody that that's who I'm talking about and that's who I'm referring to, I'm
Right.
going to use the word woman every time, and I'm going to get the utility out of that information.
But
You can
say they look
say
like a male. Say they have all of those characteristics on their person, but they still look like a male. Then what do you call them?
a cross-dresser.
But that doesn't entail anything about their gender or sex. Like, you can be a woman crossdresser, a man crossdresser.
Well, sure. Like, yeah, but okay. So yeah, so you would say that it would be a male in woman's clothes, I suppose.
I would say like a feminine man or a feminine male. Right?
Well, I don't think that that's generally how we engage with it, though, because I think if they actually look like a woman, we will call them a woman. And you can even see this play out.
We call them a woman, right?
Well,
but if they look male, we generally call them men.
But you're saying that those two things are the same thing. So obviously,
if they look like a woman, generally make the inference. Like, the majority of people in society, if they see a female, they'll assume. If they see somebody that looks like a female, they'll assume woman, and vice versa.
Yeah, gender seems to signal sex, but the point is that they happen to be different things. Like, we seem to be communicating different things when we talk about them. The utility in the communication is different, even. Like, whether or not the biology matters when we're talking about women doesn't seem to actually come into play. And so you can say, well, you're wrong about the matter of the fact, but the matter of the fact changes based on what it is that we're communicating, right?
So, by the way, I literally just saw this comment. I did not mean to say men can breastfeed. I meant to just say breast. Sorry. Very much misspoke there. Somebody just messaged me, Saanvi, you think that? No, I don't. I meant breast. I'm so sorry. But basically, to move on from that, I think there's a distinction, though, between, like, feminine societal traits. Like what you mentioned, there's nothing biological about carrying a purse. Yes, that is true. There's nothing biological about carrying a purse. It's just a trait we typically associate with females in our culture rather than males. And such is true for, like, high heels, tights, everything you mentioned there. So I think that we already have sort of a term for that, which is femininity. So what would be the need to just say women are people who engage in those societal stereotypes, whereas men do?
I think lots of times when we use a word like woman, we are communicating sex. Like, words have different contexts where they're going to communicate different things. But like I said, it seems like the majority of the time you're getting the utility out of the word woman without knowing the sex. And it seems like if that's the case, you're referring to something different. You're referring to gender there. So when we're talking about a man or a woman, there's this entire conceptual thing. So like I mentioned, like the spectrum and the prototypes at each end of the spectrum, we're talking about like how close you get to that. So it's not a math game of like you have 51% feminine characteristics, so that's what makes you a woman. There's obviously going to be weighted characteristics. Some matter more than others. You got somebody who has the dress, the tights, the heels, all makeup, all of that crap, but they have a big old beard. That beard seems to be weighted way above all of the other things, and you're probably going to refer to that person as a man just because they have the beard. There,
Right. And I think the same goes for like most trans women. Like they can have all of those social traits, but ultimately, if they still look like a male, then they're going to be referred to as a man by most of society.
but I think that that's in protest. That at least seems to be the case. Like, I'm in the space that I exist in, trans people are insanely disproportionately represented. They are probably about 20% of the community that I exist in, with like the debate community. There's, yes, it is a very high percentage. People who are even in protest trying to misgender them end up accidentally not misgendering them over and over. And we've even seen this with people like Ben Shapiro, Matt Walsh. Like, they actually end up engaging with them in the way that they would prefer, or with their identity or whatever, because that seems to be the natural way that we engage with feminine characteristics, or like feminine, like if they fit a concept for the most part, we seem to engage with them that way, even if there are biological features that are sticking out.
So I'm not sure about your community, but I do know that like 28%-ish of trans women actually get SRS, and about 40% undergo hormone replacement therapy. And as I'm sure you probably know, it's much easier for a trans man to pass than a trans woman, just because testosterone can suppress estrogen easier than vice versa. But for most trans women in society, since the statistics show the majority of them aren't medically transitioning, they're still likely going to appear as male.
Well, that's what I'm saying. That, like, just enough feminine characteristics for them to fit the stereotype to some extent, we seem to engage with them in that way, regardless of the fact that there are some male, some biologically male characteristics that'll stick out. So like having a square jaw and having broader shoulders, being taller, that doesn't seem to break the concept for most people in practice. And I don't have the study, but there's actually a study that shows that, like, when presented with people that are that have transitioned but are not passing, most people seem to engage with them and call them women and use she, her, even in very conservative societies.
Right. Even I, in some instances, would be willing to do something like, maybe not call them a woman, but with the whole pronouns or name thing. But I don't think that most people think that if they're clearly male presenting, I guess the first thing that comes to mind is Dylan Mulvaney, and you might disagree with me on if they are male presenting or female presenting. I personally look at them and I see a guy. I'm pretty sure a lot of people feel that way too. So I think that's why a lot of people have continually referred to Dylan as a man, not a woman.
Yeah, they're not passing at all. But again, it seems to be in protest. Like, that just seems to be the case. Like, it seems like they would actually naturally engage with these people with mostly feminine characteristics, like they are actually women. I wish I had gone and gotten this study. It took me like an hour to find it the last time, so I don't even want to try to find it now.
I am curious though, like, what do you guys, I often hear people who are for transgenderism mention, like, oh, would you treat them as a woman? Like, what does it really mean to treat a stranger like a certain gender in your guys' view? Besides, like, the pronouns thing can be circumvented, so besides that, what would that entail?
Yeah, like if it's a woman, I'll talk down to them, treat them worse, act smarter than them, all this. No, I don't know. Like, we're talking about, like, pronouns, like there is a different way of engaging with different genders. Like, men engage with women differently than men engage with other men. I don't know if women change all that much in the way that they engage with each other, but I know men definitely change the way that they talk when they're talking to women versus men in person. There's tons of studies on
what do
that.
you mean by, like, okay, in terms of, I think that might be the case if they're attracted to the woman, but say they're just an average looking woman versus an average looking dude. Doesn't a stranger treat them relatively the same?
No, so yeah, it doesn't have to do with looks or like sexual attraction, like body language, the speech patterns, the like there's a lot of things that change in the way that we interact with different genders, and so it
So when
seems
people
to change
say,
a lot.
like, would you treat them as a woman or man, they want you to like modify your body language and your patterns and all of that?
I'm not sure exactly what you're talking about because I don't think I've ever heard this specifically. So I like, I'm guessing and then just telling you what it is that I know about the way that we engage with different genders just based on communications that I've studied. But I don't know what you're talking about when people say that. Like, I think generally
Well, have you
if
ever
they're
heard
talking
sort
about
of like,
trans people, they're probably just
yeah,
talking about pronouns and like
right.
not misgendering them.
And which is why when we talk about like the utility of gender and what we actually mean when we refer to like women and men, how it serves more utility, like say the pronouns issue can be fixed by just calling people their names, their given names, the noun instead of the pronoun. So why besides that does it serve utility to say like masculine woman would truly be a contradiction?
Well, so there's a couple different things that we're talking about here because one part is like political in or like another part has to do with like how we deal with somebody with some sort of mental illness and like how you accommodate them, and then the other one is like just how we actually engage with different genders. And so that's, I'm not sure which part you're talking about.
I guess I won't get into the political stuff because maybe we have more to agree on there because I'm not too fond of some legislation being passed. I think it's something I don't agree with. But with the masculine woman thing, like, do you think that if somebody was fully masculine and fully woman, that that would entail some type of contradiction?
Based on the way that I'm describing it, yes. Like,
Okay.
based on the way that we understand. So there's, like I said, so there's woman that when we're referring to sex, and we use woman to refer to sex, but not most of the time. It seems like most of the time we're engaging with some sort of conceptual woman. Like when we talk about womanhood or manhood, we're talking about femininity and masculinity. We're talking about how they embody what we think of as a woman. And this is even though it starts off as this like biological thing, it changes into a conceptual thing. Just like a parent starts off as this biological parent, a mom and a dad. Eventually you can adopt a kid. We'll call you a parent just because you're filling the role. You fit the concept of what we think of when we think of a parent. Just the same as there's an airplane that flies in the sky, but if we can fold a piece of paper into a similar shape that does a similar thing, we'll start to call that a paper plane because it's conceptually a plane. For gender, we seem to start engaging with things because there's social roles that have built so thickly around the sexes. We start to engage with those roles instead of with the sex because the sex is so covered up at this point.
Okay, yeah. So I do see what you're saying. And with the airplane analogy, I don't know if you watched my debate with Vaush, but something similar was brought up with like, do you think a stone lion is a lion? Like, we might say, hey, look at that lion over there, and we're not referring to a literal like biotic organism, we're referring to a statue. And I think we just do that for the sake of saying like, this looks like that.
Yeah,
But if
that's a
somebody
little
says,
bit
is
different
there,
because that's a reference back to the thing instead of it being a conceptual thing. It's like actually referencing it. Yeah.
yeah, so like with the airplane thing, like if I was like, oh, I'm gonna go build an airplane, you're like, really, Saanvi? Like, I had no idea you were into mechanical engineering. I'm like, no, like I'm going to build like a paper airplane. Like when we make those clarifications, I think it becomes clear that we're just saying it's an airplane because that's what it looks like. That's not what it actually is.
Sure, but we don't make those clarifications with everything. Like, not for a parent. right? We don't actually clarify on whether or not it's a biological parent or an adopted parent, because they're filling the role, and in most contexts it doesn't matter. Unless there is a context where it does matter whether or not they're biological, we don't seem to care, because it doesn't actually play any part in what it is we're communicating. Just the same as in most cases when we're talking about gender or a man or a woman, the biology doesn't actually come into play. It seems like there is a concept that we're engaging with, and there's a group of people who politically do not want to engage with that concept because this seems to go against what they believe. And so in protest, they refuse to acknowledge the concept and refuse to engage with the concept. But like linguistically, philosophically, like there's a consensus that this concept does exist, and that is what we're engaging with.
Yeah, so quickly addressing the paper airplane thing first. So the reason why I think it is different than saying like trans women is because I don't believe a paper airplane is a real airplane, but I do believe an adoptive parent is a real parent, because that word is used in two different senses. But it would be rather absurd to say the word airplane is used in two different senses to that, which would include a piece of paper being folded, right? Like,
Well,
if we
that's
ask
what
the
I was
majority-
saying. Well, that's what I'm saying. It's that, like, I wasn't using the paper airplane to say that we're just going to call it a plane. I'm using it to say that things that already exist in its prototypical form can turn into a conceptual form, and we end up engaging with the conceptual form. So then I used the parent analogy to say that, like, there are times when the context matters for whether or not it's a biological parent, but unless the context matters, we don't actually care whether or not you're a biological parent, because that's not what we're engaging with, and that's not what we're communicating when we use the word. Just like with a woman, if you fill the role and you present that way, generally that's what we're communicating with, and that's what we're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, what would be the difference between just communicating that somebody is female presenting in your view versus just communicating that somebody is a woman?
Only the fact that they're so this gets a little bit more this gets a little bit off topic out of like the linguistic part, but it does seem as though we have these identities that matter to us. And especially, I don't think this is specific to trans people. I think that there's more than enough evidence to show that detransitioners go through something traumatic when they transition, because they don't actually have gender dysphoria. And so if you don't have gender dysphoria and you transition to another gender, that seems to be a traumatic experience for people. And
can I ask a quick question with that?
Yeah,
Sorry, just before you go on, because there is a lot of movement these days saying like you don't need gender dysphoria to be trans. What are your thoughts on that then?
I like, so that's another complicated question. Like, when we say trans, we're talking about somebody who transitions. So to say you don't need gender dysphoria to transition, I think that that's ridiculous, because yeah, we have more than enough evidence to show that there are problems that come with transitioning if you don't actually have gender dysphoria.
Even like social transitioning, would that be sufficient to be transgender to you?
That seems to be the main thing. That seems to be the main thing that causes most problems, is the social transitioning. So like, do you know the John Money story of the kids?
Yeah. I actually only found out about it through this whole debate thing. I didn't know about it prior to that.
Yeah, so like the kid didn't actually have gender dysphoria, yet they forced them into transitioning anyways, and this caused a lot of problems for this kid, because it seems like masculinity has biological components to it. It seems like testosterone really pushes things in us that make us interested in different things and care about different things and focus on different things. And so that really drives our masculinity, just as estrogen seems to really drive femininity within women. So once that drives that, there seems to be something, as humans, we just innately identify with things that we can categorize ourselves in. We want to feel like we belong to something, and then once we find that as our identity, it just locks in. I don't know how to explain it better than that, and I know that's a little bit too general, but like that just seems to be the case, that we highly attach the thoughts of ourselves with the identities that we categorize ourselves in. So like just saying I identify with something. So this is another thing that trans people say. It's like, oh, well, you can just identify with whatever you want. It's just an identity. That's insane. That doesn't seem to be the case. You identify with things that you gravitate towards. So if I call myself a Falcons fan, but you come into my house and there's a ton of posters all over my walls that say like Falcons suck, go Patriots, crap like that, you are not going to want to call me a Falcons fan, because you don't categorize me that way. And it seems really weird that I categorized myself that way. The only reason that I would call myself a Falcons fan is if I see people called Falcons fans and I think that there's some sort of there's something that I relate to within that group that I identify with, and so therefore I would want to categorize myself in the same way as they categorize themselves. So
yeah, so with the Falcons fan thing, I would say the way and I guess a lot of people are using the term fan, is that you just like or enjoy something. So then if we were to see something that indicates you don't like or dislike something, like Falcons suck, we would think that that entails a contradiction. So it'd be like, wait. But then if you explain that you're using the word to mean like, I'm a Falcons fan, which means I really like the people who enjoy this particular sports team, I think that is different than saying I'm a Falcons fan. I think that just means I like the community.
Well, it would be the commonality, though. It would be the commonality that you have with that community. Generally, that commonality is your love for the team, right? Like, so one way or the other, you would assume that the love for the team is what makes you a Falcons fan. So like the word,
but that doesn't seem to be the case here, right? Like this person says Falcons suck, so what is the commonality there?
There isn't one. This is like the contradiction is kind of what I'm pointing out in this case, that like this person, it doesn't make sense that they would categorize themselves that way. Nobody would ever do that, because there's not something that they actually identify with in this scenario. And not only would they not do that to themselves, but nobody else would categorize them that way either, because the commonality is not actually there.
Right,
so when
because
people
that's
say,
not how most people are using that term in that sense.
Right, so when people say you can identify as whatever, or gender is just an identity, that doesn't seem to be the case. There seems to be some matter of the fact that we're categorizing there, and everybody seems to share those categorizations.
I agree, and I think a lot of gender expansionists don't agree with that, maybe. Like Vaush, for example, when I debated him, to just say like a woman is somebody who identifies as a woman or orbits around this category or whatnot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but he also thinks definitions can be circular. So
yeah.
My head exploded when he gave you the stuff about cool, because you were right. Cool just means I like that. That's all it means. It doesn't mean anything else besides that, but he kept giving these things to make it sound like it was circular and meaningless, when it's not. It means I like that. That's just what it means. Like, it's not...
Right. Whatever it may mean, whether it may mean something's in style, fashionable, whether you like something, whatever sense we're using that word, we don't use it circularly. Otherwise, that would be just the equivalent of saying X is something that's X. Like, you're not telling us anything.
Well, the context that he gave you is, I can say those clothes are cool, and you think I like that. But if I say that's a cool person, what I mean is they're actually a popular person. Like if I say they're one of the cool kids in high school, I'm actually saying they're a popular person. So now the context is totally changed and the meaning is totally changed. But it doesn't, because when we say they're a popular person, that literally means a lot of people like them. So it's still the same thing. Like, we're still referring to people liking the thing. Like, that's still what cool means. So he was just totally incorrect in even the examples that he was giving. I was getting so upset. I didn't even finish the debate because I was so frustrated watching it. But yeah, so when you ask like where the utility comes in to like not misidentifying somebody, I think was the question, like that there seems to be a real identity there, and for somebody with gender dysphoria, that misidentifying thing seems to be a lot stronger and have much worse outcomes than for other people. But for you, if you just randomly everybody just started saying you were a guy and you don't know why, but they just start saying you're a guy and they think you're a guy and they start using he, him, you would probably develop gender dysphoria. You would probably start to develop some sort of dysphoria where the way everybody else sees you is not how you see yourself.
Okay, so if somebody, I think the pronouns issue, if they were to use he and him, what are they actually referring to? What do we refer to when we use he and him pronouns? Just somebody that looks like a male?
Yeah, I don't know. I think pronouns are a lot more complicated. I dug into this for a while with some people, and I thought we had it figured out until they said, well, because they said they, them is never used for people. So it doesn't make sense that like non-binary people would ever use this. And I said, well, if we think of non-binary people as the people in the middle of the spectrum, they're the androgynous people. It kind of makes sense that they have something different. And we do use they, them, like say somebody calls your wife in the middle of the night and they answer the phone and you say, hey, who are they? Like, or who's calling? Tell them, you know, it's 4 a.m. Who do they think they are? Like, you don't know the gender of the person. And so you'll start using they, them. And they said, okay, but you'll also say, who is it on the phone? They're like, so now you're using it as a pronoun for the person. So is it okay for people to just start using it as pronouns for androgynous people as well? And I was like, oh no, everything just fell apart. I don't know anymore.
Some of them do that to themselves voluntarily, so.
I know somebody who uses it's as their pronouns. So yeah. I don't understand it, and I think to me it's just so far outside of the bounds of human language and the way that we use it that it doesn't seem to make sense. It's for a lot of people, like especially in Vaush's camp, they purposefully misuse language because they want to challenge the way that we're using language, and they feel like the more they expand the way that we use language, the less will be pushed into boxes. But they don't believe that there is any fact of the matter in gender. They don't believe that estrogen or testosterone actually drive gender in any way whatsoever, and they just don't seem to believe that like there's anything biological about gender in any way whatsoever. So those people who do these sorts of things, they're not actually trying to make sense of it. When they say, oh, well, it's okay that it's circular, they literally mean this because they don't care about the bounds of language or about the bounds of social norms or the bounds of biology. They just want to continue challenging things and expanding it as much as possible to make it senseless. That is the point in doing it.
And I do think another reason why you might disagree so heavily with them is because under your view, not all trans women are women and not all trans men are men. Like only some trans women are women and some trans men are men. But under their view, they want to be fully inclusive of every single, or at least most trans people.
Correct.
So that's why it's a little bit tricky there because their goal is inclusivity.
Yeah, so this is a fight that I get into with them a lot, where they'll get upset with the stuff that I'm saying and say it's transphobic. And I try to explain to them, I'm not saying this is the way it should be. I'm saying this is the way it is. I'm describing how we use language, not how we ought to use language. Like I'm engaging in pragmatics, not politics. But they're only engaging in politics. They don't engage in pragmatics whatsoever. The way the world is does not matter to them whatsoever. They will continue to project the way that they want the world to be onto everybody else until that's the way the world is. That is their plan. Is just to keep projecting until that their projection becomes reality.
Yeah. So, what would be like your thoughts though on like a lot of people argue that it doesn't serve utility to define sex and gender differently because in many social spaces we do, say women and men, but we really just mean male and female.
Well, so even outside of just man and woman, gendered things exist. Like they just do. Dresses, purses, like we gender these things. These things are not biology, but they are heavily attached to the female sex. Like at insanely high rates. They are attached to the female sex. We associate them with the female sex regardless. So the concept of gender is already built in our heads, whether we acknowledge it or not. Like, we all acknowledge this thing that is gender without knowing we're acknowledging it.
Okay, wait, I kind of forgot where I was gonna go with that. So like, if we, in social spaces, when you refer to utility, are you more so referring to the harm that trans-identifying people face when their identity is not validated by others, or
No,
what are you
no, not
kinda
at all. I'm
okay.
talking about like pragmatics of like what it is that we're communicating in the scenario, like the utility of that
Okay.
communication, like what it is we hope to get across and what it is that that is being perceived when the communication comes.
Right. Okay. So I think like in many social spaces like sports or whatnot, a lot of people aren't referring to people who simply look like women or simply look like men,
Correct.
but rather referring to people who have these innate biological things.
Correct. Which is why I said, like, there are obviously contexts where we are referring to sex, right? We say a woman's locker room or a woman's bathroom. Seems pretty obvious we're talking about sex. But there's, if somebody's walking on the other side of the street with all of the things I was talking about, long hair, dress, you know, makeup, tights, high heels, like all, you know, nail polish, all of that crap, we're going to point at them and say, hey, you know, do you see that woman over there? We're not referring to the biology. We're referring to the
Aren't we
things
just
that we
making
can
an
see.
inference that they're female though?
Well, so that's why I keep saying, like, it obviously signals sex, but it's not the same
Yeah.
thing as sex. And so if I say, it's like saying the tail of the plane is the same thing as the engine of the plane because they're both parts of the plane. They're not. These are two separate things, and we, like, they're, as humans, we're going to categorize things as deeply as we possibly can, and these just happen to be two separate things. What we're looking at and what we're communicating versus what the underlying truth is behind that thing. Those are going to be separate things. So we're looking at the outside of a car, doesn't mean we know what the engine is. We're not going to guess what the engine is, though we can probably, we can probably guess what the engine is just by looking at the outside of the car. We're still just looking at the outside of the car to decide what the model is. And if you all of a sudden put a different engine in the car, we're not going to call it a different kind of model. It's still the same freaking model.
Right. Yeah, I think that's because the essential property of a car may not be the engine, but what would like the essential property of women or men be? Just the way that they're like perceived, I guess.
Yeah. Again, it's what you're communicating. If I say, like, you know, if I'm at work and I'm talking about the woman over there, if it happens to be a male, that's not going to change my communication whatsoever because their biology changes nothing for me at work, right? That means nothing to me. It gives me no utility within that communication. It has no bearing on what it is I'm talking about. And that seems to be most context. Most context, the biology actually has no bearing within the communication. But the presentation does. The presentation seems to have most of the bearing on what it is we're communicating in most instances. Again, that's not all context, so when I say most, I'm not talking about everything, I'm not talking about it all the time, but I am saying in most contexts, the sex of the person doesn't actually seem to come into play.
Right, yeah. So I think another implication of that, I don't know if you would agree to this, would be say somebody travels abroad, that they could be seen as a different, that they would be seen as a different gender than to which they left in some context. So like you can be a woman in one part of the world and a man in another part of the world and vice versa.
Sure. I mean, there's places that supposedly have more than two genders even. So like there's obviously that already seems to be the case anyways. I meant to mention this. Normally I mention this at the beginning of every conversation and I forgot to. So obviously, like, the question is, what is a woman? But when I'm approaching it, I'm not talking about trans people. I'm just talking about gender, right? I'm talking about, like, pragmatics and what it is we're communicating. Obviously, trans people challenge those concepts in the language, and so it's good to use them to try to understand what it is that we're talking about. But I think most everybody else, when you're talking to Vaush, when you're talking to Radical Coder, when you're talking to Hunter Avallone, like, their entire point is to try to make it to where trans people fit into this box, whereas I'm more so talking about the pragmatics of the language.
Yeah, I understand that.
Okay.
Kind of like I mentioned, your goal isn't inclusivity per se, rather just like an analysis of linguistics, if that's fair.
Yeah, well, and you seem to understand these things a bit more, which is why I wanted to talk to you, because most of the time when I talk to people, they no matter how far into the conversation I get, they're still arguing against trans women being women, whereas I'm like, I don't like it. If at the end of this conversation you believed everything I believed and you still didn't believe trans women were women, I wouldn't care. But they don't believe that, because it's hard for them to separate an understanding of gender from trans people, whereas in linguistics that just seems to be like, we've had this understanding of gender being a separate category from sex, and like within the linguistic philosophy, they've been digging into this, they've been writing books about it, they've been studying it for decades and decades, and it's a very well-rounded field of understanding, to where they're even teaching, you know, courses in universities and crap now. So we seem to have like a very solid understanding of what it is that we're talking about now. It's just hard to separate it from the political movement a lot of times.
Right. Yeah. So something I do think about is, like, say there's a little plastic toy of a shark, and you'll hear literally the majority of people say, like, oh, to their kids, oh, do you want to get that shark? Or I'll buy one of the sharks, or something like that. But we understand that they literally don't mean a shark. So what are they communicating, right? And I think addressing the question of what are they communicating is different than addressing the question of, like, is what they're communicating what that actually is. So I guess that's maybe a little bit of a confusing way to put it, but, like,
Well, it's not just that, but it's also the utility of the communication, because like the parent example is a great example of, like, what if I tell you that's their parent, you might think they're their biological parent, but you don't actually care if that's their biological parent, right? Like, you just care that that's their parent in the end, like, because the utility within that communication has nothing to do with the biology most of the time. There are some times where it does.
Even in that case, you could literally say, like, babysitter, and I would give the same, like, equal level of non-concern. Okay, as long as it's a guardian, that's valid. Like, who cares, right? Like, oh, that's their teacher. Yeah, they can go with them too. That's probably fine. So, like, things like that too. I don't think that we're necessarily communicating gender in the same respect for trans and gender people.
No, the point is that you can assume a biological characteristic based on the communication, but that biology is not essential to that communication. Like, just because the assumption comes with the communication does not mean that is the communication. If I say a lion and you think of something with fur, that doesn't mean that if all of a sudden it doesn't have fur, it stops being a lion, because the communication.
Let's say I do think of, like, a biotic organism, like a living organism.
Sorry?
Like, say when you say lion, I do think of a living organism. That would make it to where I don't think a stone lion is a real lion.
Yeah, of course. So earlier I was talking about the fact that a stone lion is actually a reference to a real lion, just as a drawing is a reference to a real lion. Those are going to be a bit different because they're referencing something else. Whereas with the parent example, it's not referencing something else. It is the thing that you're communicating. It just happens to come with the assumption of biology when that's not essential to the communication.
So then what if we were to just say that, like, feminine presenting males reference women, but they are not actually women?
Feminine presenting males are what?
References to women, but they're not actually women.
Well, again, it's based on the communication, because if you're if you're calling it a woman. Like, you can say that it's a type of woman, sure. If you say like, hey, this isn't just like a woman, it's a trans woman, sure. I don't think I would disagree with that. But generally, if you just say woman, people are going to know who you're talking about. But if they say man, they're not going to know who you're talking about. Even if it's a trans woman who has some sort of like showing biological characteristics, and you say man, people are still going to be a bit confused. But if you say woman and they're actually presenting as a woman, it's going to be pretty obvious. Do you know who Taftage is?
No, I do not.
So it's a trans woman who was on your side of this argument in a debate that I had a while ago. And one of the things she asked me, she said, okay, so you know those cake competitions that they have on TV where they make them look like all sorts of different things. Let's say somebody makes a cake and it looks like a camera. Is it a camera or is it a cake? I said, well, again, it's based on the utility of what it is you're communicating. Like, what is it that we want to get across, and what is it that we hope is being perceived when you say what this is. We would call it a cake because that's actually what matters in the scenario, because hopefully it's about you eating it or something like that. A camera isn't just a shape. A camera is a thing that you take pictures with. A phone has a camera, but it's a very different shape and looks very different. Even though we have a concept of what we think a camera looks like, it still comes in many different shapes and sizes. But we'll call it a camera just because it takes pictures. We're getting that like communication of the utility of the thing across. We want you to know it takes pictures. When we call it a cake, we want you to know that this is a type of thing that you can eat, and what the texture is going to be like, what it's going to taste like, all of that stuff. Like it is the utility of the communication that matters in each scenario.
And like, why wouldn't it be the case that similarly, what we are trying to get across when we see somebody like a feminine presenting male is just that they are a femboy?
A feminine, again, like you can. I just don't think that that's the way people actually conceptualize these things. Like, I think in general, they're going to look at them. So there are women with very masculine traits. There's women who have very broad shoulders and like wider jaw lines and crap like this. But
Right.
it doesn't seem to matter as long as they present femininely. We still look at them as a woman, just as anybody else presenting femininely enough, we're going to look at them as a woman as well.
Well, yeah, we'd assume they're female, but like, say like we have a butch lesbian or somebody like that. I saw this story about how this butch woman got kicked out of a woman's restroom because they thought that she was a male, but different story. But so somebody like that, for example, when people are interacting with them, they still think of them as a woman, even though they might look more male than female, because of the fact that they're a lesbian, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so with a chair, there is this concept of a chair. And there's a whole lot of characteristics that go into making the chair. We can take away, like, normally we'll think of like 4 legs, a wooden chair that has like a back and armrests on it that one person can sit on. But if we take away the 4 legs, it doesn't stop being a chair. And we can look at this like spectrum of where it gets farther and farther away from this prototype of the chair, where it gets a computer chair to like those big egg chairs that you see in like artistic places or in Men in Black. Like, it just gets farther and farther away until eventually it's in this gray area where we don't know if we call it a chair anymore. Maybe now it's a bench or a stool or a love seat or a couch. Like, but we're not so sure anymore. There's butch lesbians are kind of on the spectrum almost towards the androgynous spot, where they get into that gray area where it's very hard to tell which one they are and which one they aren't. The gray area isn't going to like make or break the concept, because we know the gray areas exist and that there will be parts that are harder to differentiate.
Yeah, so I think one thing with that is that when we see like a butch lesbian, and that they may look more androgynous, as you just said, or towards the middle of the spectrum, if they were to say, well, no, I'm actually like female, like I'm a woman, I think people would very quickly rescind what they were saying and say something else, right? Even though we may be like, and start referring to different things, if that makes sense.
Sure, but that's the same thing with trans women, yet that's not changing my definition of a woman, right? Like the how we engage with these things in practice and how we conceptualize them are going to be a little bit different. Like if I want to communicate the word woman to you, even though they don't fit it, I might appease them by calling them a woman. Whereas if I want to communicate woman to you, I want it to be something that actually is going to be worth communicating, right?
Right. Yeah. So like if they were to say like, oh, like I grew up a girl, like I menstruate, I go through all of these things that you guys go through, like I think I am still a woman even if I don't like present as one.
Yeah, I'm saying in practice, just because people say, yes, I will call them a woman because they say that they are a woman, but I can't see it. I can't tell that they're a woman, like, visibly. That's still different than, like, how we conceptualize it. So saying somebody says, hey, I identify as a man, they don't look like a man whatsoever. They're just kind of asking me to call them a man. In practice, I'll just end up calling them a man just because they asked me to.
Right.
But that's in practice. This isn't how, that doesn't change how I conceptualize a man whatsoever.
Right. Yeah. And that's not what I don't necessarily disagree with that because the same would be true like for under the biological view is that just because somebody may look a certain way, if you don't really believe them, you would just go off of what you think you believe or just be respectful towards them. I think like my view with this is that a lot of people, I think what the disagreement we're having is that you use feminine and masculine and androgynous as a spectrum for like gender, whereas I'm sort of using feminine
I'm sorry,
and
your mic
masculine.
is making a lot of noise right now.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Is this better?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. I moved my headphones. But I'm sort of using it in conjunction with gender, like masculine woman, feminine man, like these two things like never being in conflict. And I think I don't know, just like in a lot of social spaces, we do use them interchangeably, even though people may present a certain way, I guess. Because say like you ask many people the question, do you believe men can give birth? What they're like even if they were to imagine somebody with long hair and a dress and tights and a skirt and high heels, they would still say no, a man can't give birth. So I think I don't know, just another one of those contexts where people just don't believe that gender and sex are really different.
Yeah, I think that the way that people interact with it proves otherwise. The like you said, it's going to be the same issue for anybody who says sex and gender are the same thing. Like the butch lesbian, you're not even sure when she says I'm a woman, you're not even sure if she's a woman. Maybe she actually has a penis. You have no freaking idea, but she's telling you she's a woman. So you're just going by that.
Right, just like when somebody tells me I'm not a murderer, like I have no idea if you're telling the truth or not, but it doesn't have any bearing on the matter of the fact.
Right. And so that's what I'm saying, is that like in practice, these things are going to be very, very different than the way that we actually conceptualize them. Just the same as how we interact with them in practice is very different than what the like biological fact of the matter is.
Yeah. I guess maybe if you could describe a little bit more of that. I know we touched on some things that in practice we sort of interact with like behaviors and whatnot, but kind of what more do you mean by like interacting with women versus men?
Well, so I mean, like, again, when I'm talking about the communication, like the saying man or woman, using those words and what it is that we hope to get across when we say that. What is it that if I say woman, what is it that you're looking for? What is it that you think of? What do you conceptualize? And what is it that you're like, if I say look at that woman, what is it that you're looking for? What types of characteristics are you looking for when I say that? What is it that you're I guess the point is I would lose utility if I say, look at that woman, but I'm talking about biology and they look feminine to you, right?
So like I don't really think so. Like say somebody dressed up like a dog and like you really couldn't tell, you would say, "Look at that dog." And then I'd be like, "Wait, no. They're actually just a human."
Yeah, sure, but that's the thing, is that you don't actually know. Just as you don't know with the bush lesbian, you don't know with the with somebody who might be trans, but you do know the way that they're presenting. You do know what they look like. You do know that they fit the concept.
But certainly you don't think that like phenotypically the way something looks just because we need further scientific testing. That's the way the categories are defined.
Again, you're making it sound like science defines the categories, and it doesn't. We decide what the categories are. Science tells us about the categories, but it does not define them.
But I think like when we refer to these categories, we're making an inference for such, is what I'm trying to say. Like when we say human, like we might be imagining, somebody that looks like you or I, but we know you don't have to necessarily look like you or I to be a human. We're actually mentioning like a Homo sapien organism.
Well, no, we had words of human before we knew, like, anything about the science differences or evolution or anything like that. We were referring to the fact that we looked like humans. Like, that's how the word came about. That's how we use it. That's how we engage with it most of the time. It's very, very few, like, it's a very small percentage of the time that it has anything to do with some sort of scientific difference. And it actually has to do with the phenotypical differences.
Yeah, I do agree that people like looked and they made a lot of associations and recognized patterns, but certainly they were wrong about some humans not being humans and vice versa, right?
So it depends. Like, if you defined human based off of some sort of personhood and you're separating personhood, like, it again matters what it is that you're communicating with the word and what you think of when you use the word, what is actually being communicated. So if they say, well, black people aren't humans, and everybody knows that black people aren't humans, then it just, when you communicate the word human, it is true in that moment that they are not human, because the word is not made based on some sort of scientific matter of fact. It's made based on what, or the definition comes from what is being communicated.
Yeah, I do see like kind of what you're saying. Like when people say like have a little humanity, they don't literally mean like be a little bit more human. They mean just be more empathetic, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like people do use words in different senses, and I agree with that. But more so what I was trying to get at is that we would punitively agree that some people that they phenotypically looked at that didn't meet a sufficient threshold of physical characteristics, they didn't classify them as human, but we would all now like classify them as human.
We would now,
Because
but we've broadened our definition of human, whereas back then they didn't. Like, we broaden definitions of things to be more inclusive, or because there's some sort of value that we're categorizing that that we've changed. Like, even what is a mammal has changed over time, and now we know that there are mammals who can actually lay eggs, but before it was based on whether or not you laid eggs. So like the definition changed. What, like, whether or not it's a mammal didn't change, right? So whether or not somebody was a human didn't actually change, but the definition changed to include them.
yeah,
And the only
no,
reason the
I
definition changed is because what it was that we were communicating changed. So like the word woman didn't exist until very recently, within the last couple hundred years. And they, well, I guess that's not right. It's about, yeah, I guess a couple hundred years. Yeah. A while ago. So we had where for man. Man meant human or person. And
like
then
mankind, right? Yeah.
yes, exactly. That's where, so lots of times you'll get these, what do you call it? Radical feminists who are like, it's so sexist that we call women woman because we're still attaching them to the man. No, woman actually meant like a female person. So like, where meant man and with meant female. Like, and then with changed to with man which eventually changed to woman. And it all just changed over time based on how the words were being used. And so it evolved more and more over time to mean different things. And to, or sorry, it's not to mean different things, but to have different words that we were using to communicate the same thing. But now the word is actually...
In this case, we're communicating different things over time, like with humans.
Yes. And it's not that we're actually... So when we say like we're changing the definition, right now within linguistics, we're saying we're realizing another reality that we've been communicating this entire time that we were just unaware of before. So it's not that we decided to change the definition. It's that there's something underlying that's being communicated that we were just unaware of before. And now we're just recognizing that there's another definition that we didn't recognize before.
Okay, yeah. So when we have this gender on a spectrum thing, if you will, we have femininity on one end, masculinity on the other hand, then we sort of have non-binary in the middle. I think if we go under this view that like you kind of look at somebody and you make these classifications based on what they look like, how would agender be a thing? Because wouldn't everybody automatically be categorized somewhere on the spectrum?
Yes, everybody is on the spectrum.
So agender doesn't really exist.
Correct.
Okay. That makes sense. I think that's a very reasonable take as compared to some of your like counterparts for sure. Just letting you know.
Yes, no, I'm well aware. And this is why, like I say, like I try to talk to people like Hunter Avallone, but it seems like, so when I first came into the space and they were all talking about gender, every conversation devolved into gender somehow. And there were always like half the panels were always trans people. And so it always got into a conversation about trans people and gender. And every single person talked about it so radically different from the last person. I had no clue what they were talking about. I was pretty far right. Like I was trying to understand what the hell these people were talking about, and I didn't understand it. So I started to dig into it, learn more and more. Pretty quickly, I realized literally none of them have any clue what they're talking about, that there's tons of academic research on this and a pretty like solid consensus on these things, and none of them are engaging with the literature whatsoever. So I started coming on and talking about these things and like and having more and more debates on it. Pretty quickly, people like Vaush changed radically on what it was that they were talking about. And it seemed like, and I'm just saying it's just my perception, just I can't know, but I know Vaush, I've never asked him. I feel like it would be weird to ask him, but from my perception, it seemed like they were trying to adopt my language and what it was that I was saying. They were just doing it very poorly because they still wanted to hold on to their ideology while using the language that I was using. They wanted to take what I was saying and apply it to their like gender abolitionist ideology where all that matters is gender identity and there is nothing else besides that. And so, yeah, it seems that they just literally don't know what they're talking about. They have no idea. They're just hearing other people who they know what they're talking about, and then they're taking that and trying to apply it to the belief that they're refusing to let go of. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that totally makes sense. Like, what do you think about people who say, like, what people present as or pass as is very, I guess, mind dependent? Like, it really depends on the subject that we're talking about. And the agent who's recognizing them. So what do you think about how somebody looks like a woman to one person, somebody looks like a man to another person? Like, what is their gender?
I think it doesn't. I think that generally when we have concepts like this that are like that we're kind of socialized to understand, there's a pretty universal like understanding of it. Like we all know what we're talking about. It's not all that subjective. So like,
but you don't think there's times where there's like literal disagreement and it's split between people?
There is, but in very small ways. So if a woman is made up of feminine characteristics, the characteristics are what we're going to disagree on. So whether or not something is feminine is based on whether or not we associate that characteristic with a female. In some places, they may not associate that characteristic with a female. And so they may not consider that one characteristic feminine. But it's very, very rare that there's going to be enough of those to change the entire concept, because there's so much that goes into what we would call a woman. Like, I'm just naming off like very broad things, but there's like body language, you know, like the eye contact, the way that people move their hands, the way that they talk. Like, there's just so much that goes into what it is that's feminine and masculine, to where it can't just be one or two things to kind of change the entire thing, unless we're talking about some sort of biological characteristic, like we were talking about earlier, where there's weighted characteristics that seem to matter more than others.
Right,
A beard
like
is obviously yes, it's obviously a biological characteristic that you're not going to be able to just shake off and and think of this person as a woman. They got a big old freaking biker beard. Like, that's not, that you're not going to be able to ignore that. So yeah, there seem to be weighted characteristics that will matter more, but those weighted characteristics are going to be even more universally understood and acknowledged. So yeah,
So like with the bearded thing, like obviously we take that to be even more of an indicator that somebody is male rather than female, in my opinion. But with this view, do you believe, sort of, if you wouldn't mind explaining, if people are men and women at the same time? Because somewhere, somehow, somebody is perceiving you as a woman and me as a man. And in this society, we are being perceived as woman and man respectively. So wouldn't it be the case that we're all women and men in different contexts? Or I know
it
I
would
kind
mean
of
that
asked.
there's not a fact of the matter. If that's, I think that's what you're asking. There's not a fact of the matter. Things that are socially constructed and conceptualized, there's never a fact of the matter there, because it's always going to be based on the culture and the time and what is being communicated with the words that you're using. Like, we kind of create reality, a lot of reality, with the words that we're using. So like calling something a Walmart, we all kind of picture like buildings and stores and stuff like that, but that's not what Walmart is, right? Walmart is so much bigger than that. Like, Walmart is a whole company. It's got a lot more that goes into it than just the building itself. It's a whole company, but we conceptualize this thing. Walmart itself does not exist anywhere. It's not like it's not a real thing, but we're constructing this with the language, and we know based on the way that we talk about it that it's not this objective thing somewhere, right?
Because it's socially constructed, you're saying?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, that's kind of what I was. So with the Walmart example, I think when we're, saying that's a Walmart right there, we sort of mean like that's because that's what concerns us most, is that we're just going grocery shopping, like we're going to the supermarket, so that's what would concern us. But like somebody that maybe works for corporate Walmart sees that in a different respect when it's being mentioned,
Right. Or somebody who owns stocks in Walmart, or yeah, like there's or if we're just watching a commercial for Walmart, like we definitely conceptualize these things very differently based on the context there.
Yeah, I disagree with that. I know we're a little bit off topic, but just going back to like the trans
No,
stuff.
I mean, we said earlier, just, I mean, for the audience as well, we said earlier we were not going to like have like this debate or anything. We could have done this on Modern Day Debates or something like that, but we decided to just have a conversation instead. So I'm fine with the way that this is going.
Okay, good. Yeah, I just was hoping you would be fine with it. I was just like asking questions. If you had any for me, please feel like you can ask, and I'm not asking all of them.
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't mean the I've had this debate so many times at this point that I think the that your stance is pretty easy to understand. It's more so the arguments against my stance that I'm more so interested in. Is like different ways of looking at it, different ways of engaging with it. So yeah.
Yeah, okay. So I mean, I guess one difference I would have is I think in society it does serve more utility to just refer to men as an adult human males and women as adult human females, rather than like females as femme presenting people and men as male presenting people, if that makes sense.
Say that again.
Yeah, I do think it would serve more utility to refer to women as adult human females and vice versa for males.
Hmm.
What is kind of your thoughts on that? Do you not think that, having those definitions serves more clarity in our communication and things like that?
I think again, in specific contexts where the biology matters, yes. Like I where people want to get rid of that definition and be like, oh, we can't have that definition anymore. No, of course not. Like that's still what's being communicated in a lot of circumstances. So that's not going to go away. But the like, if you go look it up, the definition that I'm giving you is what's going to be in any dictionary, because that we understand now that is also what's being communicated. Like, this is just context dependent.
Yeah, I do see that point of view. What do you kind of mean by context dependent? Like when people are referring to medical things or sports, they're referring to women and men in terms of sex.
Yeah,
And
I
when
think
people
you
are,
know when somebody's talking about sex. Yeah, like if it's if you're at your doctor's office and they ask, are you a man or a woman, you know they're asking about sex. Like, you're not confused about that. Like, it seems to be, if somebody's if you're on a dating app and somebody says, are you a man or a woman, you know what they're asking. Like, you are very well aware of what they're asking, right? Like, it seems to be pretty straightforward, because it's such a rare amount of times that somebody is actually talking about sex that it's blatantly obvious they're talking about sex, right?
yeah. So in other contexts, what other contexts are you kind of thinking where we're talking gender and not sex? Like when people say man up or something like that?
Oh no, like any social context, like at work, on the streets, at a restaurant, playing video games, having debates, like on the internet. Like, yeah, just a pretty much most contexts. Just it seems to be that, yeah, like unless you know they're talking about sex, it's pretty like you're going to fall back to gender.
Okay, so do you think that it is possible that people are just referring to sex, but then they just don't really care truly what their sex is? They're just referring to it for the sake of English and being grammatically correct within the use of pronouns?
Yeah, so I think that they have this definition in mind of what it is that they want to communicate. So it's like with the lion earlier, where I say, like, this is a lion, and I tell you, like, there's a lion over there, and you think, like, okay, well, this is going to be something with fur. It's going to have like all of the biological things of a lion, and scientifically blah blah blah, but it doesn't have any fur. Like, it's not going to stop you from calling it a lion. Just as if I tell you somebody's a human, you assume they have a red heart beating inside of them. But if you found out it was a green heart beating inside of them, it would literally change nothing for you. You're still going to call them a human, because what, like, you're
Because
communicating.
that's not what defines a human. Like none of those things, right?
Right. Well, exactly. So that's what I'm saying is, but that, hold on, you're doing it backwards, where like the communication is where the definition comes from. We're not communicating based on a definition. The definition comes from the communication.
Okay, so when we are communicating, okay, so when like somebody at work is saying she's sitting over there, what if they're just communicating an adult human female, but they don't really care about it? They don't really care that they're an adult human female. They're just communicating it for the sake of linguistics in the sentence.
I don't know that that's possible. Like, in order for you to communicate something, there has, like, the utility
I don't
has
think
to be within the communication. Like, for you to just say, like, well, they don't care about it, that doesn't matter. Like, even if I intend to communicate something, it doesn't matter if I intend to communicate. If I say the sky is green, but I mean to communicate blue, doesn't matter. I said green, so.
Well, yeah, that's just because people like we're just yeah, I can say something's immortal and then I define immortal as above 5 foot, and suddenly we're all immortal. Like clearly there's concepts that we're referring to. It's just the question of do we actually care about these concepts when we're using them? So if somebody says like, "Oh, look at that girl over there," what they just mean is that she's an adult human female, which okay, then that be the end of it. Um, so what are your kind of thoughts on that?
Um, So there's a study of linguistics that is actually based on the intent. But like, pragmatics is not really going to care about your intent. so much. Like, it's supposed to be like a neutral stance just based on what's being communicated, not what intends to be communicated, not what you hope they're communicating or anything like that. It's just based on what is actually being communicated.
And what
And that's
is
how we come to definitions.
okay? So like, say somebody like actually communicated something that was irrelevant to like, okay, so say we have like, look at that human sitting over there, or look at that elderly person sitting over there. The things that they're trying to communicate may be distinct from the way that the terms are like ordinarily used in senses, but they're still like giving no regard, if that makes sense. Like when you say that look at that human
I
sitting
would
over there,
need
like
an
you don't really,
example where that would actually be the case, though, because I don't think that's even a thing.
but like, okay, so like when we say like, what do you mean by that's a woman over there? What are you referring to? And then they describe a female. Then what?
Well, then that's just one of those contexts where they are talking about a female. Generally, you know, based on the context, right? So if I say, this place is cool, there's like most of the time based on the context, you're going to know if I'm saying it's cool as in I like it, or it's cool as in like it's cold in here, right? It's going to be the same with this. Now, if I walk into a place and you're not sure and you say, what do you mean by that? And I say, oh, I mean that I like it. Like that's fine. You're just like being more specific. But most of the time we use words in all sorts of different contexts that where we all understand what it is we mean because of the context itself.
Yeah. So okay, so say we take one of these casual like contexts where it's not medical or anything like that, and we say, "Oh, look at that pretty woman over there." What do you personally think that people are referring to? Just somebody that looks like a female? That's what they're referring to?
Yeah, like we say looks like a female. Yes, I think that's not the way that I would put it. I think that's a little bit less specific, but yeah,
Oh
sure.
yeah, you can go ahead. You can clarify. I just was trying to.
Like a feminine person, yeah. But yes, it's because the reason I wouldn't say looks like a female, because there's a couple of steps separating that where we would say like they look feminine. Feminine is why we call them woman. A woman, like we assume a woman is a female, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're a female all the time in all contexts.
Right. So when you think that people are calling this person on the street, oh, hey, look at that pretty woman, that they're talking about this feminine person.
Yeah, it depends. So like if I walk up to somebody and I ask them, are you a man or a woman? And it seems like there's some sort of sexual interest, or I might be hitting on them or something like that. Normally, that's the only time you're even going to ask, right? Or if you're, because generally, if that's not what you're asking, I think normally you would ask, like, what are your pronouns or something like that if you're just asking for gender. So, yeah, I think based on the context, based on the way that you're communicating it, I think people are going to know what you're talking about most of the time. But again, obviously, just for the audience sake, like we're again talking about very niche scenarios. Like 99% of the time, it's not gonna matter which one they're intending to communicate,
Like
because they
99% of the time
align
you can tell if
anyways.
somebody's female or male.
Well, not even that. It's that a man or a woman and a female align. Like a female is going to be feminine 99% of the time anyways. And so it doesn't matter which one you intend to communicate in 99% of scenarios.
Yeah, I think we're kind of saying the same thing. You just use feminine instead of female, and I say female.
Yeah, well, because even when you say like that's a pretty woman, you might look at them and think, so what you're doing is you're looking at a presentation that is feminine, and then you're saying, okay, based on that feminine presentation, I am assuming that that is a female, and I think that person that I'm assuming is a female is pretty, right? There's a line of logic that gets you there, but it's not necessarily what is being communicated with the word. So yeah.
like say like a straight man said something like that and they found out that this person that they called pretty was a male, then they would clarify that they're in fact not attracted to them or something like that.
Well, it
So I
seems
think
like
that
they
lends to
are
the fact that
attracted to them. They just wouldn't be happy with the fact that they're attracted to them, right?
No, I think you can lose attraction based on that.
So you can be attracted to aesthetics. You can be sexually aroused by somebody, but those are going to be different things, right? Having like whether or not I want to have sex with somebody does not necessarily mean that I'm attracted to their aesthetics. Those are not necessarily the same thing all the time.
You can lose a liking for either. Like for example, like have you ever, like there's a food you really don't like, and then you're eating brownies and they taste good, and then they find out, oh, there's actually spinach in the brownies. A lot of people will feel like physical disgust when they eat it next. And I think the same goes for stuff like this. I think the more information you find, your your physiology can change.
Yeah, maybe. All right, like I sure. There's going to be we're talking about something a little bit different at that point, but yeah, sure.
Yeah, I guess that's the example I was kind of saying. Like, if a male saw, like, somebody said they were a pretty woman, he's assuming that they're female, and such is true because if they find out otherwise, then they would cease to say pretty woman.
Yeah, so again, like you're getting into like the intent of the communication. I think that there would be more utility in separating them more often. So like even though I'm saying, yeah, we understand the context of what we're talking about, I do think that like obviously a lot of the and this sounds I know leftists are going to get super pissed off when I say this and they'll be like, oh wow, so smart, but if we called it female basketball instead of women's basketball, or like females national basketball league instead of women's national basketball league, there would be I think that I feel like a lot of people are fighting over the woman for political reasons, and then start to like ram trans people into that category, even though because they're not actually considering the contextual differences between the two either. They're acting like, well, woman never means female, so we're just going to pretend that the word woman is never communicating female, just as the other side is saying, well, we're going to pretend the word woman is always communicating female. Whereas like, yeah, again, we have just so much information and literature on this to know that that's just not the case. Like different contexts, we're going to be communicating different things.
Yeah, okay, I hate to say this, but I am a little bit tired. I don't know if you feel the same, but I would love to be back on if you would have me on. I just think I want to go to bed. I've had such a long day.
No, you're good. We said 2 hours.
I feel like we did get very thorough though. So I did like appreciate the conversation. Thank you so much.
Yes, it was a very good conversation. Before you came on, I was talking to my audience about this because I have this debate pretty consistently, most of the time with people on the left who feel like I'm a transphobe or something like that. But I was telling them, I think you are like the person who is best at debating this topic right now. So I wanted to talk to you about it because the debate you had with Vaush, the debate you had with Hunter, it was just so blatantly obvious you knew so much more than them. Like they had absolutely no clue what they were talking about. So yes, I enjoy watching your debates.
I'm doing another one on modern day tomorrow, but it's about abortion, not gender. But if you'll be streaming after that, I know it's a Sunday, so I don't know if you will. I'd be down to join again if that's okay.
Yeah, cool. I'm totally down. I stream pretty much every day. I'm also pro-life, so yeah.
Oh, you are? Okay, that's actually surprising. Okay.
Yeah. I'm
cool.
a surprising person.
Okay, wait. Where do you kind of align politically, if I may ask? I know it's like kind of a stupid question.
Who knows? I have no freaking idea. It depends on who you are or who you ask. The left says that I'm a conservative. The right says I'm a progressive. I call myself a right-wing progressive just to confuse the hell out of everybody. So.
Okay, well, that's very interesting. Gotcha. You're definitely the most informed person I've talked to about the linguistics aspect of gender, so thank you for that.
I'm sorry, you cut out for a second.
What did you say? No, I was saying like you've definitely given me stuff to consider with respect to the gender conversation in linguistics.
Cool. Yeah,
Yeah.
I enjoyed the conversation. You had a lot of really good questions, so this is good.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much. Have a good night.
Thanks. You too. Bye bye.